Hello, Kaikos here. My university gave me an assignment for a 3-month project, so I would like to share what I have been doing for the last 2 weeks. And I know what you're thinking, how many projects is this guy working on at the same time? This doesn't mean that I'm abandoning Ascendum and Mendasium, like Ascendum should still release this year. This came up in my university, and whenever a game project has to be made, I go ugh, and go full focus mode on that, so it would mean I'm just pausing Ascendum and Mendasium for these 3 months. However, since I'm still making stuff, I decided to share my progress on this game since it's a 3D game and somebody might be also interested in that. And since this game will be finished till the end of August, I will put it on itch.io for free so that you can play it if you want. So, let's begin. The game itself should be a top-down roguelike combat game placed in a fantasy/sci-fi world where the environment is kinda fantasy, but there are bits and pieces of alien ruins that are sci-fi. This is the scope that I had in mind for these 3 months, and you can imagine how my teachers reacted on this when I presented it in the beginning. Maybe it is a little bit too much, but keep in mind that here I'm a leader of a 6-member team and that I'm also kinda fast when it comes to developing combat, enemies and bosses. Sad thing was that the rest of the team wasn't really available in the first week, so the art progress is not the best, but it already started catching up in the last week. I started with the Procedural Generation first, since it is kinda the most important system in the game. I quickly scrambled this algorithm over here that is going to generate a map of rooms, kinda like in Binding of Isaac. There are many different ways to do this, but I solved it by having a 2-dimensional array of coordinates and the starting point always being in the middle. Every coordinate stores information on which directions are expected and which ones are blocked, and of course a boolean if the room is placed there or not. And I have a list of 2D coordinates which is going to store all of the available points for the rooms. So every time I spawn the room, I have to go through all of the directions possible, meaning left, right, bot and top, and since I'm using 2D array, this is basically just one index difference from the spawned room. Then, if the room exit is pointing in a direction, add that direction to the list of expected directions of the coordinate, and if not, then add the direction to the list of blocked directions, since we don't want the rooms that are pointing to a closed wall. And finally, add the points that are pointing to the exits to the available points list, since we want to spawn the rooms over there. Then I pick a random point, remove it from the list of available ones, and spawn a random room over there that meets the requirements of the expected and blocked directions. But it's not a closer since I want my map to keep going. Then I apply the same point logic to the newly spawned room and keep repeating the process. I'm repeating this until the number of the currently available points plus the number of rooms spawned is less than the desired number of rooms. The algorithm needs to know when to stop eventually, so I added this desired room number so that I can easily control the size of the map. When this main loop is done, we are left with a couple of available points, so I just go through all of them and spawn a closer room over there to completely close up the map. And that's kinda the main algorithm. If you set this up, it's kinda easy to keep adding more stuff, like I added 2 additional zones which basically repeat the whole algorithm but from one of the connected points as a starting point. Then I went through all of the rooms and measured their distance from the start point. The ones with the longest distance are marked as boss rooms, while the others are treasure chest rooms. While doing that, I also assigned a value to every room coordinate which just stores the distance from the start so that I can then define ranges of values that can be used for difficulty scaling, since I don't want players to encounter a difficult enemy in the first or the second room. But how does this relate to the game idea I talked about in the beginning? Well, the actual room will be like an environment piece that is closed out by the cliffs, rocks or something like that, so it will surely be larger than 1 or 2 screens. Considering this and the fact that I don't want to bug fix every little thing that is going to break while trying to enable and disable rooms in one scene, I decided that every room will be its own scene, and that the procedural map generation I was talking about earlier is going to tell the game which scene to open so that it seems like it's a big connected world. Of course, For this to work, I need to set up a minimum of 15 different rooms that have all of the different combinations of entrance, so I did that by copying and pasting a lot, which is the reason why every room looks exactly the same right now. But that doesn't really matter, since I just wanted to prove that the generation works properly. In the room, I made the room manager as well, who is going to manage spawn points for collectibles and enemies, and spawn stuff depending on the values from the generation algorithm. All of these points are in the same places right now, since, as I said, I copied and pasted the rooms, but again, it doesn't really matter, since somebody else in the team is going to mess with the actual rooms and how to make them different from each other. Then, when I was sure that the procedural generation is working, I moved on to the second most important thing, and that is the character. When it comes to the top-down combat, I'm always preferring a battle ride style camera movement, simply because you can aim in 360 degrees and the camera is not going to keep the player in the center, but adjust to the aiming direction a little bit, so that you can always see where you are aiming while still keeping the player character in the screen. I want the character to be a bowman, and some of you who watched my early Mendasium devlog know that I like bow and arrow for some reason, but somehow I always keep scrapping it in the end. So this time I'm going for a hunter idea and I will not scrap it, hopefully. I sketched this concept and I tried to make him without actual limbs that are connecting his hands and legs, because then I don't have to make an actual rig and I can animate everything inside Unity. However, even with this, the biggest challenge was the actual animation, since he should be able to walk in a direction while still being able to aim in every direction at the same time. My solution for this was to separate the whole model in two parts, the lower and upper part, and then animate them separate. So the lower part is going to lean forward towards the direction of movement, while the upper part is going to rotate around with the mouse. In theory, this shouldn't really work, but since his front and back side of the body kinda looks exactly the same, you cannot really notice if his body is turned in the right direction, so whatever, it works. I just had to offset the upper part via code to match with the leaning of the lower part, and that's kinda it. This approach also enabled some easy shooting animations, because it only moves the upper part, which means that I can add as many animations as I want and I don't have to worry about lags at all. I also wanted to try out the Unity Cloth component, so I did, and now he has also a little scarf that features real-life physics. I'm really happy how this turned out, but now it was time to move on to some game design and what he is actually going to do. I was always a big fan of Hunter in WoW Classic and how you have to use both melee and ranged attacks on lower levels. So I decided to implement a range attack as well as a melee slash attack. And from there on, I started overcomplicating the mechanics, since that's kinda one of my favorite things to do in game development. So pressing or holding a left click will make the character shoot 5 arrows before taking a second to recharge, and the 5th arrow will deal double damage. The player has a melee range, and if an enemy gets close, he will slash the enemy instead of shooting. Then I added health, since we want the character to be able to die, of course, and stole the channeled heal from Hollow Knight. This time, however, I think I'm fine with this, since the games are quite different, so I can steal a thing or two. Then, since I want a character to unlock abilities throughout the game, I need a way to manage all of the abilities. So I added an energy bar that fills up when you damage the enemy. I had an idea that there will be 2 types of abilities to unlock: powerful arrow ability and the trap ability, since he is a hunter after all. The trap ability, the player will be able to aim on the ground and throw, but it will take a second before the trap is actually functional. This itself includes a mathematical equation called Bezier curve, but I'm not going to go into that since nobody likes math. I'm going to try to come up with as many different traps and arrows as possible, and hopefully make them synergize together so that there are many different builds possible. Right now I have 4 of each, and those are explosive arrow, that detonates and deals massive amounts of damage in the radius; frost arrow, that deals some damage and slows everything for 90% for 2 seconds in the radius; black arrow, that shoots a volley of 3 arrows which then explode and deal damage in a small radius; and the poison arrow, that applies poison debuff on everything in the radius and deals the most damage of all arrows, but the total damage is dealt over 4 seconds. From traps, we currently have Fire Trap, which explodes and deals massive damage in the radius. Frost Trap, which freezes the target, breaks on the first damage dealt, but it multiplies that damage by 2, meaning you should try to break the freeze with your hardest hitting shots, possibly with an explosive shot, since you can nearly one-shot some creatures. Shadow Trap, that makes a black hole effect and pulls everything towards the center for 1.2 seconds, and the Sticky Trap that leaves a ground effect for 5 seconds, which slows everything for 75%. If you manage to do an explosive arrow over it, it will ignite the ground and start dealing constant damage over its duration. Shooting a frost arrow over it will apply a freeze to everything in the radius instead of just slowing. Hopefully you can see what I'm trying to do with these spells, and I will try to add as much as possible in the future. I'm also really surprised with the particles I made for this, since this is done in the same way I am doing all of my particles in 2D as well, using free simple sprites and no textures at all. I will probably make a tutorial on this topic when I finish this project, but till then you can also check out my Steam game Ascendum, which uses the same particles and will be released this year, so go slap that wishlist button and get notified for the release discount. Back to the ability. Casting an arrow ability requires 2 energy bars, while the trap costs only 1. So technically, you can set up 3 traps at once, or use both arrow and a trap for a combo if you want. I decided to stick with only 2 bonus abilities per run, since the number of buttons is slowly getting out of control, having a button for shooting and melee attack, heal, trap, and arrow ability, as well as a dash. Oh, I forgot to mention that the player will have a dash, of course, since it enables some faster combat and dodging. Just look at this biggest swoosh of my life, which is the dash animation for the character. I literally just scaled the character down for some time, but with the nice particles it actually looks good enough. But of course, at that time it was hard to test these abilities without some real enemy. So I set up the enemy classes, and since I'm working in 3D right now, I can just use the Unity Nav Mesh AI for pathfinding. The setup for enemies and attacks is exactly the same as my setup in Mendasium, so if you are interested in that, you can check out my devlog on enemies and bosses. However, what Mendasium doesn't have are the health bars. I have seen so many different ways of doing health bars, some also spawning them in the world and making a billboard out of them. I'm just spawning it in the main canvas UI, and with this little code over here following the enemy in 3D, so no need for billboards. And I kinda felt that the health bar needs some more polish, so I duplicated the health fill rectangle and made it decrease slower. This makes it so that you can kinda see how much damage you are dealing, and it feels much more satisfying. With that done, I came up with a couple of placeholder enemies, like this guy that jumps, this ranged guy that keeps his distance and shoots, and the guy with the shield. At this time, artists became available again, so I started getting some concepts for enemies as well as some models. So with my animation skills, I brought some to life, and now the jumping guy is a little cute enemy, while the ranged shooter is this alien construct. Last but not least, in order to try out the game itself, I set up the map, which is basically what I was using for the visualization of the algorithm, but in a UI form. I also made these gates that allow you to actually exit the room after killing all of the enemies, and now the game is somewhat playable, well, at least for me. There is still stuff to add, like upgrades, bosses, and the final objective, since I want the player to be able to actually beat the game after all. Good thing is that the art department has started catching up right now, which means hopefully some nice art in the next devlog. I will maybe make 2 more of these devlogs on this project until it's ultimately finished in August, so look forward to that, and also you will be able to try out the game and play it for free on each IO, which is always nice. I'm happy with the amount of content I produced in these 2 weeks, but that is mainly due to the fact that the project is fresh and new. Hopefully I can keep this pace till the end. But that's it from me, I'm done, and until next time.